Washington has spent a century shaping the world in its image. It's a story of promoting democracy, fighting tyranny, and securing American interests abroad. From Tehran to Afghanistan, the United States has intervened with a stated goal of fostering stability and planting the seeds of freedom. But what if the very actions taken to secure peace and Project Power have instead cultivated the most virulent forms of opposition? This is the concept of blowback, a term coined by the CIA to describe the unforeseen negative consequences of its own covert operations. It is the grim paradox where the solution becomes a far greater problem than the one it was meant to solve. The allies America armed yesterday become the adversaries it fights today. The regimes it toppled to prevent chaos only gave way to far more dangerous forms of instability, creating vacuums filled by extremist groups and hostile states. The September 11th attacks, the rise of ISIS, the endless wars in the Middle East, and the proliferation of anti-American militias are not random events. They are the direct and indirect results of a foreign policy doctrine that consistently underestimated the complexities of the societies it sought to change and overestimated its ability to control the outcomes. The cost of intervention is staggering, and it cannot be measured in dollars alone. Researchers estimate that the post-September 11th wars have cost the United States over $8 trillion. Instead, it was spent on conflicts that have destabilized entire regions and fueled a perpetual state of war. But the true cost is counted in human lives. Consider the stark visual evidence of this paradox. American presidents shaking hands with men who would later be branded as terrorists. Iranian-backed militias attacking U.S. bases with sophisticated weaponry. The Taliban retaking Afghanistan. These are not disconnected events. They are cause and effect. America's foreign policy has often been its own worst enemy. This investigation will begin by rewinding the clock to 1953 Iran. Here, a CIA-backed coup toppled a democratically elected prime minister. To understand Iran, a nation defined by its anti-American stance, we must travel back to the early 1950s. This was a different Iran, led by Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. He sought to reclaim Iran's oil from foreign control. For decades, the Anglo-Persian oil company, later British Petroleum, held a monopoly over Iran's oil reserves. The terms were skewed, funneling wealth to Britain and breeding resentment. Mossadegh rose to power on a promise to nationalize the oil industry. This sent shockwaves through London. Britain responded with a crippling economic blockade. When that failed, British intelligence began to draft a covert operation. With Eisenhower's election and Cold War fears, the US joined. The stage was set for a fateful decision. With the Eisenhower administration in power, the CIA was given the green light for Operation Ajax. Orchestrated by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, this operation would become the blueprint for future CIA-led coups. The objective: to remove Mossadegh from power and restore the full authority of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was seen as a more reliable partner. The CIA's mission was to create chaos and turn the Iranian people against their leader through propaganda and staged protests. After a failed first attempt, the Shah fled. Roosevelt defied orders to abandon the mission and pressed on. On August 19, 1953, with CIA cash and pro-Shah military units, crowds stormed Tehran. Mossadegh was arrested and the Shah was reinstated as an absolute ruler. Iranian oil was back in Western hands, but the seeds of a future storm were planted. With Mossadegh gone and the Shah in power, Iran's surface glittered with oil wealth and westernization. But beneath, the Savak secret police trained by the CIA and Mossad crushed dissent with torture and fear, driving opposition underground. The only safe haven for resistance became the mosque, where Ayatollah Khomeini's anti-Shah, anti-American sermons spread on smuggled tapes. For young Iranians, Khomeini's message of religious and national identity under siege was electrifying. The 1953 coup had destroyed Iran's democratic middle ground, leaving only a choice between dictatorship and radical theocracy. Revolution was no longer a question of if, but when. By the late 1970s, the Shah's regime collapsed under a tidal wave of popular anger. Khomeini returned from exile to lead a revolution that toppled the monarchy and birthed the Islamic Republic. When the US admitted the exiled Shah, Iranians saw it as proof of another looming coup. Students stormed the US embassy, taking 52 hostages and igniting a crisis that shattered US-Iran relations. The new regime defined itself in opposition to America, exporting revolution and arming anti-US militias across the region. The coup's short-term success had created a permanent, implacable enemy. In 1979, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan gave the US a chance to bleed its rival without direct conflict. The CIA, under Carter and Brzezinski, secretly armed the Afghan Mujahideen, hoping to mire the Soviets in their own Vietnam. The Mujahideen, a patchwork of fiercely independent fighters, became America's proxy army. The US goal was simple: trap the Soviets, no matter the long-term cost to Afghanistan. This strategy, set in motion before the invasion, would transform Afghanistan into a crucible for global jihad. The seeds of future chaos were sown in the name of Cold War victory. Operation Cyclone funneled billions in weapons and cash to the Mujahideen, with Pakistan's ISI favoring the most radical factions. US and Saudi money built up hardline warlords, sidelining moderates and empowering extremists like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. The CIA encouraged foreign fighters, Afghan Arabs, to join, including Osama bin Laden, who organized recruitment and funding. The 1986 arrival of US Stinger missiles turned the tide, crippling Soviet air power and emboldening the resistance. Afghanistan became awash in advanced weaponry and radical ideology, a training ground for future militants. America's short-term victory was building a long-term threat. When the Soviets withdrew in 1989, the US declared victory and walked away, leaving Afghanistan in ruins. The Mujahideen, now warlords with American weapons, plunged the country into brutal civil war. Kabul was devastated, the government collapsed, and millions suffered amid chaos and violence. The US offered no aid, no plan for peace, and no effort to disarm the militias it had empowered. Foreign fighters, feeling betrayed, turned their anger and skills against their former American backers. The seeds of global terrorism were sown in the wreckage of America's forgotten war. Out of the chaos of the Afghan civil war, a new force emerged in Kandahar in 1994, the Taliban. Meaning students, their ranks were filled with young Pashtun men educated in Pakistani madrasas, preaching an austere version of Sunni Islam. Promising to end corruption and restore order by implementing Sharia law, the Taliban's message was initially appealing to war-weary Afghans. They captured Kabul in 1996 and established the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, imposing a brutal regime. The Taliban were veterans of the anti-Soviet jihad, trained and radicalized in the ecosystem funded by Operation Cyclone. The Taliban were, in essence, the second-generation blowback from the anti-Soviet war. They were turning Afghanistan into a safe haven for radical groups like Al-Qaeda. As the Taliban took control of Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden returned in 1996 as an honored guest. The Taliban allowed bin Laden to operate training camps for Al-Qaeda. Bin Laden's focus shifted to the United States. Enraged by American troops in Saudi Arabia, he saw it as a desecration. In 1996, bin Laden issued a declaration of war against Americans. He broadened the call, declaring it the duty of every Muslim to kill Americans anywhere. Al-Qaeda bombed U.S. embassies and attacked the USS Cole. These were precursors to a larger attack planned from Afghanistan. The blowback from Operation Cyclone had arrived. The U.S. had armed holy warriors, only to see them transform into a fanatical adversary. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda operatives brought the war home to American soil. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the Bush administration's attention pivoted toward Iraq. President George W. Bush labeled Iraq, alongside Iran and North Korea, as part of an axis of evil, accusing Saddam Hussein's regime of supporting terrorism and secretly developing weapons of mass destruction. A campaign began to build the case for war. This narrative was built on dubious intelligence. The connection between Saddam and Al-Qaeda was tenuous at best. Saddam's Iraq was a brutal, secular dictatorship that suppressed religious extremists. The justification for the invasion remained the alleged weapons of mass destruction. By the time the U.S. prepared to invade in 2003, Iraq was already a shadow of its former self. The administration's plan was based on the assumption that U.S. forces would be greeted as liberators. This vision ignored the deep sectarian fault lines of Iraqi society. The decision to invade Iraq was a doctrine of preemption made manifest. It was a monumental gamble. The United States was not just toppling a regime, it was taking ownership of a nation it barely understood. The stage was set for the next, and perhaps most catastrophic, chapter of blowback. The initial military campaign was a swift success. The regime had fallen and the conventional war was over, but the plan for governing a post-Saddam Iraq was where the true failure began. The American Occupation Authority made two disastrous decisions that would fuel a deadly insurgency. First, de-Ba'athification. Tens of thousands were fired, creating a massive pool of resentful Sunnis. Second, the complete dissolution of the Iraqi military. 400,000 soldiers were sent home without pay, creating a massive armed population with nothing to lose. It created an enormous power vacuum that the US military was unprepared to fill. The swift victory gave way to a brutal occupation and a new Sunni insurgency. As the Sunni insurgency intensified, it attracted foreign jihadists, including Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who formed Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI. AQI aimed to ignite sectarian civil war. American detention centers like Camp Bucca became universities for jihad, where former Ba'athist officers and jihadists mingled and radicalized. The US inadvertently created an incubator for a more extreme organization. After Zarqawi's death, the group rebranded as the Islamic State of Iraq, ISI. Following the US troop withdrawal in 2011, ISI, led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, rebuilt amidst sectarian policies. When ISIS launched its offensive in 2014, the Iraqi army collapsed, abandoning American weapons, arming ISIS. The group, originating from the US invasion, was now armed by the US military. The Iraq War's chaos spread, igniting sectarian violence in Syria. Inspired by the Arab Spring, protests against Assad's brutal regime escalated into civil war, creating a power vacuum. ISIS seized territory, declaring Raqqa its capital. Syria became the epicenter of a proxy war, with global powers backing competing factions. The US aiming to remove Assad but avoiding ground war, armed rebels, echoing past interventions with disastrous results. Weapons often ended up with extremists, blurring lines and inadvertently arming enemies. The US found itself bombing ISIS in support of both Iraq and, indirectly, Assad. The conflict drew in global fighters, empowered extremists, and triggered a massive refugee crisis, a consequence of the 2003 invasion. While the United States was mired in the chaos it had created in Iraq and Syria, another nation watched and reaped the strategic benefits: Iran. Before 2003, Iran was geopolitically contained. To its west was Saddam Hussein's Iraq, a bitter enemy since the brutal Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. To its east was Taliban-run Afghanistan, another hostile Sunni regime. The US invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 removed the Taliban, and the invasion of Iraq in 2003 removed Saddam Hussein. In a spectacular display of strategic irony, the United States had single-handedly eliminated Iran's two greatest regional adversaries, delivering Tehran a geopolitical gift of historic proportions without firing a single shot. This was the ultimate unintended consequence of America's post-9/11 wars. With Saddam's regime gone, the political vacuum in Iraq was filled by the country's long-oppressed Shia majority, who had deep ties to Iran. Tehran moved swiftly to exploit this opening, cultivating deep influence within the new Iraqi government, security forces, and economy. More importantly, Iran armed, trained, and funded a powerful network of Shia militias in Iraq, ostensibly to fight Sunni extremists like ISIS. These militias, known as the Popular Mobilization Forces, or PMF, became a state-sanctioned parallel military, with commanders fiercely loyal to Iran's supreme leader, not Baghdad. This pattern was repeated in Syria. As the civil war raged, Iran intervened decisively to save its key ally, Bashar al-Assad. It deployed its own elite Revolutionary Guard forces and mobilized thousands of militia fighters from Iraq, Afghanistan, and Lebanon's Hezbollah to fight on Assad's behalf. This intervention was instrumental in turning the tide and ensuring Assad's survival. The result was the consolidation of what is called the Shia Crescent, or an Arc of Influence, an unbroken land bridge of Iranian control stretching from Tehran to the Mediterranean Sea. This was Iran's long-held strategic dream, made possible only by American unleashed chaos. Today, the blowback from the Iraq invasion defines the primary threat to remaining US forces. American troops in Iraq and Syria now face regular rocket and drone attacks from the very Iran-backed militias that rose to power in the post-Saddam vacuum. These groups, armed with sophisticated Iranian weaponry, are a direct legacy of toppling Saddam. By shattering the balance of power in the Middle East, the United States inadvertently created perfect conditions for its adversary, Iran, to achieve regional dominance it could only have dreamed of before 2003. The war to eliminate one enemy had ended up empowering a far more capable and strategic one. Examining historical episodes like Iran in 1953, Afghanistan in the 1980s, and Iraq in 2003, a disturbing pattern emerges. It's a recurring playbook of intervention that the United States has followed time and again, each time with devastatingly similar results. The cycle begins with a narrowly defined objective, often driven by short-term geopolitical goals. The target is identified: an uncooperative leader or a perceived threat. The immense power of the American military-industrial complex is brought to bear to eliminate it. The first step is to overthrow a regime for short-term gain, but the complex, long-term consequences are a secondary consideration. This creates a dangerous tunnel vision, overestimating the ability to control the aftermath. By decapitating a state, the United States repeatedly sets the stage for a far more chaotic and violent struggle to fill the void. The pattern is a blueprint for instability, yet the outcome remains stubbornly, tragically the same. The solution becomes worse than the original problem. The critical stage in this cycle is the willful ignorance of the power vacuum created by the intervention. Once the statue is toppled, American attention dissipates. Nation building is either ignored entirely or pursued with naive optimism. This was the case in Afghanistan and Iraq. This failure stems from a reluctance to engage in long-term occupations, coupled with a misunderstanding of the societies in question. The collapse of central authority leads to a violent free-for-all. This vacuum becomes a petri dish for extremism. The United States created a failed state, the ideal incubator for transnational terrorist groups. The intervention ends up creating a far greater threat, forcing re-engagement. This leads to spending billions to fix the chaos, and then fleeing as new enemies take over. It's a hamster wheel of intervention, a perpetual motion machine of enemy creation. The final act of this tragedy is to tally the staggering costs. The numbers are immense, but they represent a concrete legacy of failure. According to Brown University's Costs of War project, the post-9/11 wars have cost American taxpayers over $8 trillion. This includes veteran care, interest on debt, and homeland security. These wars have directly resulted in over 900,000 deaths, including nearly 400,000 civilians. Millions more have been displaced, creating refugee crises. The United States has squandered decades of military and diplomatic capital on these conflicts. The moral authority of the United States has been shattered. This is the ultimate blowback of a foreign policy that has proven to be a catastrophic failure. There is an old, unsettling adage that empires create their own gravediggers. They sow the seeds of their own decline not through external rivals, but through their own arrogance. The history we have traced from 1953 Tehran to the battlefields of Afghanistan and the shattered cities of Iraq serves as a grim testament to this truth. The United States has consistently fallen into this trap. It has wielded its power to remake nations only to find the rubble provides building material for new adversaries. The pattern is undeniable, a tragic rhythm of intervention and blowback that has defined 70 years of American foreign policy. The story is not good intentions gone awry, but predictable consequences willfully ignored. Each intervention was a gamble that American power could surgically remove a problem without unleashing contagion. Yet time and again, the surgery proved more lethal than the disease. By overthrowing Iran's democracy, Washington gave birth to a revolutionary theocracy that exported anti-Americanism for decades. By funding holy war against Soviets, it trained the very men who would fly planes into the World Trade Center. By shattering the Iraqi state, it created a vacuum that spawned ISIS and handed a prize to Iran. These were not isolated mistakes. They were products of consistent doctrine, a bipartisan consensus that prioritized short-term gains over long-term wisdom. This doctrine is built on American exceptionalism, the belief that the United States is uniquely qualified to judge which governments may stand and which must fall. This belief has been proven catastrophically wrong. The gravediggers of America's imperial ambitions were not forged in the Kremlin or the Politburos of Beijing. They were assembled in the prisons of the Shah, the training camps of Pakistan, and the detention centers of Iraq, their shovels supplied inadvertently by Washington itself. The uncomfortable truth is that America's greatest threats are not foreign imports. They are homegrown products of its own policies, cultivated in the ruins of its own interventions. The cycle of blowback is not historical curiosity, it is active and ongoing. The drones that now target U.S. bases are a direct echo of the coup that toppled Mossadegh. The resurgence of the Taliban is the final chapter of Operation Cyclone. Until this pattern is acknowledged not as unfortunate events but as logical outcome of flawed strategy, the United States is doomed to continue digging, making its own grave deeper with every new intervention. The central lesson of this modern history is that invasions breed hatred, not democracy. Military force can shatter a state, but it cannot build a nation. It can eliminate a dictator, but it cannot create a citizen. The United States has repeatedly acted as a catalyst for chaos, a force that destroys old orders without any coherent plan for what should replace them. This approach leaves behind a legacy of bitterness, resentment, and a burning desire for vengeance. For the people on the receiving end of American bombs and policies, the narrative of liberation rings hollow. They experience intervention not as a helping hand, but as a destructive storm that upends their lives, shatters their societies, and robs them of their sovereignty. From this wreckage, new forms of resistance are born, not the moderate allies Washington planners envision, but radical, hardened groups who find purpose and power in opposing the foreign occupier. These groups offer a compelling alternative to the chaos. They provide identity, order, and justice, however brutal in lands where the state has ceased to exist. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Iran-backed militias did not arise in stable societies. They flourished in the failed states and power vacuums that American interventions created. Their anti-Americanism is not abstract ideology, it is their core recruiting tool, a powerful narrative forged in the real suffering of their people. This process transforms American foreign policy into a self-fulfilling prophecy. By intervening to fight threats, the U.S. creates the conditions that give rise to real and far more dangerous ones. It enters to fight terrorists and creates 1,000 more. The cost of this cycle is a permanent state of war, a forever war fought against endless enemies that America helped create. It is an $8 trillion mistake that has cost nearly 1 million lives. A strategic failure that has left the United States less secure, less respected, and bogged down in the regions it sought to stabilize. The enemies are not at the gates. They are rising from the ashes of America's own making. The world is littered with the consequences. An entire generation in the Middle East has grown up knowing nothing but war, instability, and the hum of drones in the sky. Their perception of America is not shaped by Hollywood or ideals of liberty, but by concrete realities of military occupation, sectarian violence, and political chaos. They are the children of blowback. Until policymakers understand that actions have consequences that ripple for decades, and that self-determination is more powerful than any aircraft carrier, this tragic cycle will never end. The next threat is already gestating in the rubble of the last intervention. The path forward is not easy, and it requires a level of national humility and self-reflection that has been conspicuously absent from American foreign policy debates. It begins with confronting this uncomfortable history head-on, acknowledging the pattern of failure and abandoning the playbook that has produced such disastrous results. This does not mean retreating into isolationism or abandoning America's role in the world. It means embracing a different kind of foreign policy, one rooted in realism, restraint, and a profound respect for the sovereignty and complexity of other nations. It means understanding that the tools of war are exceptionally good at breaking things, but utterly inept at building them. A new approach would prioritize diplomacy, economic engagement, and cultural exchange over covert action and military force. It would recognize that stability comes from legitimate local governance, not from installing compliant puppets. It would invest in building partnerships rather than dependencies, and it would understand that true security comes from a world of stable, prosperous nations, not a world of fractured client states and failed state safe havens. This requires patience, strategic foresight, and the courage to resist the siren song of simple, violent solutions to complex political problems. It demands that we listen more and dictate less, and that we see the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. The ghosts of Iran, Afghanistan, and Iraq serve as a permanent warning. They remind us that blowback is not a theory, but a law of political physics. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, and when the action is a military intervention, the reaction is often violent, unpredictable, and enduring. The men and women who planned these interventions were not all malicious. Many genuinely believed they were making the world a safer place, but their good intentions were paved over by a dangerous arrogance and a willful ignorance of history. The road to hell is, indeed, often paved with such intentions. Ultimately, the choice lies with the American people and their leaders. Will the United States continue to repeat the mistakes of the past, lurching from one self-inflicted crisis to the next, forever fighting enemies of its own creation? Or will it finally learn the lessons of its own troubling history? Will it recognize that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to build? Until Washington learns that you cannot bomb a nation into democracy or foster stability at the barrel of a gun, the cycle will continue. The gravediggers will keep digging, and the list of homegrown enemies will only grow longer.